like that. We'll have time for questions at the end. Jen will do a little presentation to begin, and then you can ask questions through the chat box, and Molly will monitor those questions. You won't be identified, so you can be specific if you need to be. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I know you will enjoy hearing from Jen. She has been a specialist at many of our Family Place workshops over the years and has always had excellent advice for our parents. I want to tell you a little bit about her before she gets started. Jen has worked as an early childhood mental health consultant for the state for 4 years and has been in private practice as a consultant and therapist for almost 6 years. She is certified in EMDR, which she will have to tell me, and endorsed as an early childhood mental health expert by the Colorado Association of Infant Mental Health. Her credentials allow her to offer continuing education credits for training in the areas of social and emotional development, trauma processing, developmental concerns, sensory behaviors, and discipline woes. She also has an 8 and 11-year-old of her own, so that keeps her fresh in the game. And so Jennifer, over to you. We are going to mute ourselves and turn off our videos and turn the whole screen over to Jen.
Okay. Thank you. That was a nice introduction. Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all doing well out there in your homes or wherever this is coming to you. As Betsy had said, this is really an open forum. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm really interested in addressing whatever concerns that you have right now, because I know there's a lot of changes in families and homes, and there's lots of stuff going on for different people. So the more I can address those particular issues, I'm happy to. So please feel free to add whatever you want to the chat, put in whatever questions that you'd like, and we'll try to address as many of those as possible. I wanted to start out just by talking a little bit about the giant and vast, the deep and wide of the impact that some of the COVID changes have had on our families, not only on ourselves, but on our kiddos, and how a lot of these things come out in behaviors and stuff like that. The first thing that it kind of feels important to address is the fact that COVID is the changes that are specific to COVID are very abstract because they don't necessarily have a really foundational, really tangible basis for the change for the kiddos to understand. So what I mean by that is, if we were at war, if there was actively something going on in our neighborhood, they would be able to see it. And unless you have a family member that is directly affected or impacted by COVID, or you've had a loss, children have a really hard time understanding sort of the abstractness, this invisible enemy that COVID presents. So it's really tricky for them to understand why we're doing all of these things when they can't hang on to anything concrete. And as we know, kids this age, especially 0 to 5, 6, 7, they're super concrete. They really like to have black and white, and they need things to make sense in a really sort of concrete way. So they struggle with that. And what they are aware of is the changes that they see around them. So they're very likely to be very attuned to your responses, to your energy, to your stress, to your anger, to what's going on in the home, to the interactions that they're observing, because that's a pretty good indication as to what's going on around them or how stressed they should be. They're taking their cues from their caregivers. And a lot of us are stressed. This is hard. It's weird. None of us know what to do. I think the best description I've heard is that it's like trying to build a house in an earthquake. There's no stable ground. There's nothing. And there doesn't necessarily look like there will be for some period of time. So a lot of times when kids ask questions that we usually take great comfort and confidence in answering in a concrete way, there's no answer. And so there's no comfort. So like, well, how long will we do this? I don't know. What does this look like what will happen next? I don't know. Am I going back to school? I don't know. So a lot of times we're able to answer those questions and give concrete answers because we've all come to trust our routines and our consistency that we have. And those things aren't available to us. And it's creating a lot of anxiety for adults and a lot of anxiety for kiddos. Kiddos aren't the only ones that struggle with the absence of routine. Adults like it too. And so they're vibing that energy from us, that we are out of work, that we're at home, that our routines are blown, that all those things are different. And it can be really impacting on their behaviors and their level of anxiety. There's so many changes, right? So they're seeing routine, lifestyle, siblings, the transitions, food or lack of it, parents' availability, parents at home or parents being absent, other family absences, schools, friends, etc. I mean, you name it, everything has been impacted. Even if it was a regular thing that we always went to the store on Sundays, and we don't do that anymore, all of those things sort of impact how they understand the safety of their world. And I think that's an important piece of kind of a segue into how we understand the safety of our world, because we want to understand this as in a very broad sense of the word, a trauma. A trauma is we can think of big traumas like catastrophic traumas, big T traumas. And that's if the house falls down, if the house burns down, if somebody robs you, something really sort of catastrophic happens that challenges your entire world. That's a big T trauma. Little T traumas are the tiny little nuancy things that happen all the time that challenge your sense of trust or safety in the world. And we really want to define trauma as any event that challenges your sense of safety in the world. So even if it was that mom was sick for a day or 2 days and she didn't get off the couch and make me a sandwich, that person who is sort of my lifeline and feeds me is suddenly not okay. And so that creates this anxiety and this trauma response. And like I said, this is a really globalized, generalized definition of trauma, but we want to understand it in those terms because it helps us understand a little bit better about how these things are impacting them. Because even when we don't necessarily think that anything big has happened, there are still tiny little T traumas that happen that create that anxiety and that discomfort. So sorry, I want to make sure I catch up on my notes. The other thing that happens with trauma with kiddos is that it doesn't necessarily present in the same way that it would for older kiddos or even adults. When we have traumas or when we're dealing with these anxieties, we are sometimes we're able to talk about them, and sometimes we deal with them in other behaviors. Sometimes we're more angry, we lash out. Sometimes some of us are drinking a little bit more than we usually do, but we're all trying to cope. Kiddos who don't necessarily have access to those sorts of tools and they don't necessarily have access to language typically express these types of traumas in more behavioral terms. So we see a lot of behaviors that look really different to us and can kind of make us worry because suddenly they're not sleeping. They're dysregulated in their sleeping. They're dysregulated in their eating. They're fussy, inconsolable, angry. They're tantruming. They're defiant. There's a general dysregulation. All of these things are indications to us that our kiddos are struggling, and that they are looking for some sort of normalcy and routine and consistency. So I think that's something that's really important to pay attention to because there is this idea that we have to make sure that they're meeting their social emotional goals. And we want to make sure that we're really encouraging independence and we're doing all those things. And all of those things are true. On a typical developmental trajectory, those are the things that we're looking at. This is a disturbance in that trajectory. This is something that needs to be attended to because it is disruptive in that trajectory. So yes, it's important. Yes, we want to make sure that they're getting those things, and yes, they will. But right now, if our kiddo is struggling, they're unable to eat, they're fussing, they're fighting me more, they're more defiant, there's just this sort of unruliness or all-time anxiety, then we want to attend to that and help our child kind of get back on track. Because this is very much something that is a hiccup in what would otherwise be typical development for our children. And it's a distraction. When the brain is developing and it's doing all the things that it does and it's meeting all the milestones and it keeps doing that and it's going great, and there is a trauma or there is a disturbance, then the body and the mind are distracted from their typical development because they need to attend to the trauma that's at hand. And so that's what we're seeing. And so as parents, we go, okay, but we need to be doing this, but that's not where they are. And if we are inattentive to that, or if we are avoidant of that, or if we're dismissive of it, and we try to go, okay, well, this is what we're doing. Yes, that is what we're doing. And at the same time, dismissing this isn't going to make it go away. And it's not necessarily going to address the issue for them, and could potentially cause more disruption or further disruption as we continue in the developmental path. Now, a lot of the kiddos that you probably have out there are very young, so young that they don't necessarily have these conversations with you, and they don't know what we're talking about. And so they're even more dependent on watching you and seeing how you behave and what's going on in the home, and all of the changes that they see in their routine, and then the changes in anxiety or stress that they see in the parents. And so those are things that we want to tend to more behaviorally. So we want to be aware of our tone. We want to be attentive to them when they're struggling. We want to be compassionate. We want to be able to sit with them and play when we might otherwise find something to busy ourselves because we're feeling stressed too. Having compassion for it. As many of you probably know or have experienced, if you have your own grief or your own stress and somebody says, oh, well, you should get over it by now, it typically doesn't make it go away. But what does help you move forward is that compassion. And we can share compassion with little ones behaviorally, and we can share compassion with older ones with our language and behaviorally. And those are the things that create that trust and that stability so that they can move forward in their development. So I'm happy to talk more about how we respond, and I want to do that as well. I think that's important because I know some of the questions that we have already are about that. And if you guys have more questions, please go ahead and throw them in anytime. The other thing I think that is important to talk about is grief, because everybody knows what grief is. The process of when you lose someone. We have the death in the family, and it's very possible that many of you out there are experiencing that and are dealing with deaths in your own family, or losses in your own family, and that can have a tremendous impact. For littler ones, it's harder for them to understand because they don't necessarily, again, have the language to understand what's going on. They just know that that person is gone. But there's another type of grief that I want to attend to, and that is ambiguous grief. And ambiguous grief is the concept that we don't necessarily lose a particular person, but there is the death of something. There is the death of routine. There is the death of safety. There is the death of expectations, or there is the absence of answers or reason or facts about why that is. So that type of grief is very difficult. And for adults, we can understand this when, I mean, even divorce can be particularly an ambiguous grief, because there was something that we had and that was important to us, and we've lost it. And we might still have that person in our lives, but the expectations that we had around that relationship and the relationship itself having shifted, and whatever that means to our parents, to our children, and to us as parents, that all shifts, and that's ambiguous grief. And so a lot of our kiddos and ourselves are experiencing a lot of ambiguous grief. Again, there's no answers, there's no timeline. Some of us understand it in a number of different levels, and depending on where you are on the scale of concern about COVID, it impacts all of us because we see it all around us. And it's at the store, it's everywhere you go. So that ambiguous grief really does impact kiddos and creates anxiety. And as we give this language, I'm imagining that a lot of the adults out there listening can really relate to that, because there is this sense of loss. When you think of this, like the stages of grief, right? There's denial. Well, I don't know what this is like. This doesn't make any sense to me. It won't last long. And then there's anger, and there's bargaining, right? Well, we only have to do this for a couple of weeks. Well, I'll probably be fine if I just do this. There's all these sorts of stages to grief. And I think we can find ourselves all in those stages, whether we've had a direct loss from this or not. It certainly has impacted us in a lot of ways, and our routines and our children. So I feel like that's an important topic, and it's something that needs to be spoken, because again, I hear people a lot in my work talk about, well, I haven't really had a loss. And so sort of almost like their experience doesn't qualify as serious because they haven't had anyone directly lost. And I want to be aware that we sort of move away from those qualifiers, because even if you didn't have someone in your life that you love that has passed from COVID, or you haven't seen it directly impact anyone, it doesn't mean that it's not affecting your life. And it doesn't mean that those things aren't necessarily impacting your family and your routine and your sense of safety in the world. This is a big one. I mean, it's one thing if you had a little bit of cognitive dissonance around, well, I believe this or I don't believe that. It's another thing when your sense of safety in the world is challenged. And when we think about trauma, again, in those terms, we understand that this is a traumatic experience for everyone. This is a global traumatic experience. And so when we're attending to it in that way, we have a little bit more compassion for ourselves and a little bit more forgiveness for the room that we need. So if we say, you know what, shut the windows, it's a movie day, then it's a movie day. If we're set on getting out and doing something, then we go do something. There's lots of different ways to handle this. And I know people are all the way across the spectrum on how they're dealing with this in their own families. And I think that's an important part of this when we talk about grief, because the conversation around grief, again, whether it's a person that you love that has passed or whether it's ambiguous grief, how you present it and how you approach it really is dependent on your family values. So if you are a family that has faith and you believe in heaven and hell, then that's a conversation to have about when you lose someone that they go to heaven, right? So that's a family value that really shapes and defines how we're going to talk about it with our kiddos. And that can be as broad as any other topic, right? I mean, we could talk about all the different responses all day long, but we really want to attend to what feels right for your family, how you want that to be presented, and then bring it into developmental terms that are right for your kiddo. Because that's the crux here, is how we present it to our kids. So if we're screaming and yelling and saying, I hate this, then they're going to get a really strong message, which granted, I'm sure I've done myself. We're going to get a really strong message that, that it's not okay, that they're not safe, that there's something to be worried about, that there's a lot of things going on, and whether they see it or not, mom's freaked out. And so I should probably be freaked out too. One of my golden rules when I'm talking to parents about how to talk to kiddos is the rule of what to say and how to say it. So a lot of times the kiddos, and not so much the little younger ones, but the little bit older ones, right? When they ask you a question, they ask you a question at their developmental level, and that speaks to what that is they're trying to understand. And as adults, we get really, I don't know, eager maybe to dive into a concept, an adult concept, or to make it, to have this be the opportunity to have them really understand something, when that's not where they are. So really, my rule in my own parenting, and I've found it to be really helpful, is if I answer a question that leads to another question, then I've overshared. And what I mean by that is if I say something and they go, but what's the death rate? Or right, there's some other thing. Then now I've introduced a concept that is more adult than what they're asking. Then I've sort of pushed past their developmental conceptual level, and I've tried to move them into a different area, and that's just not where they are. So I try to answer the question specifically pertaining to what they're asking. And it might be 2 or 3 days before they come back and ask another question. They process it. For my kiddos, sometimes it's taken a week or 6 months, and they say something else. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that landed. I didn't know that was in there. But I have found, and I've learned from other parents too, that if we push past that, then they're like, whoa, I don't get it. And they tend to push it away. So sometimes that can be a really important piece of how we attend to our kiddos and how we respond to them and what we share or don't share. I'm not suggesting that you lie to them, because I think it's important to be honest. But I don't necessarily think that we want to give them more than they're asking. And I'm happy to talk about more of that too, but I think it's really important that we attend to what it is they're asking. And the other thing that we want to do in these moments is rescue our kids. We want them to feel safe, right? And we want them to feel like it's okay and that it's going to be okay. And part of that is because we have a culture that wants to protect our kids and keep them innocent for as long as possible. And I appreciate that. I love that. But I also know that there are times when that's not necessarily the truth. And that by lying to them, what we're doing is creating an environment where they can't trust even the person that they're getting their information from. If they were to get information from you and then get different information from a different adult, or overhear a conversation where you counter what you've said, or any of those sorts of things, it starts to really kind of grind down on their trust and give to the anxiety about, well, I'm not really sure I know what's going on here. And I'm not sure I get the information that it aligns with what I'm seeing. So if we say, yeah, it's a scary thing, then it's a scary thing. Because what we can do, if we're honest with that, then is model for them what it's like to take care of yourself. So I can say, yeah, it is a scary thing. And this is what we're going to do to take care of ourselves, right? So I can model then, I have an opportunity to say, yep, I'm scared too. So I've validated it. I've said, yep, that makes sense. I'm scared too. I've normalized it because, yep, that's a human thing. It's not just you. We all have those fears. And then I can apply an appropriate coping skill, and I can model for them what it looks like to take care of myself when I'm struggling with something. Because if our hope is to raise them in a perfect world and expect that nothing was going to go wrong, they're going to have a hard life. And especially if this is the start, they already know we're lying. It's not going to necessarily go like that all the time. So if we can set them up to be successful despite the discomfort, if we can, for lack of better languaging, if we can assist them in learning how to suffer well, then we can allow them the opportunity to move beyond those obstacles, to trust in themselves that they can overcome, and to have faith in themselves and their community that they can be successful and persevere. So those are some sort of broad ideas around how we want to present to our kids when we're talking about it. But again, I think it's really important that it is specific to your family values. So I can't give you a specific paragraph to read to them, because that might be what I say to my kids, and it doesn't necessarily work in your family. So I think it's really important to honor each family and where you're at and what you want them to understand about this, whether it has to do with your values or your religion or whatever that is. I think that's an important part, and I want to honor that in these conversations as well. Let's see. I think that is.
Are you ready to take a few questions?
Yeah, should we start with some questions and let's see where it goes?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Molly, did you want to have those for us? Thank you.
Are there any lasting effects to being isolated from other children for so long? Should we consider sending them to school?
So yes and no, and yes and no. So yes, there is an impact for being isolated, absolutely. And the social development is key, and we know it's key for that 4 to 8 years old and upward, right? That there's this really, that's when we start to really begin to socialize and share and figure out all of those things. If there are siblings in the home, they're going to get that anyway. Of course, it's not as broad of a spectrum as it would be at school or in other settings, but there is access to that information. And before that age, when they're still in parallel play, when they're not really acknowledging other people and they're just kind of doing their things. And if you know what parallel play is when you see 2 young kiddos, 2, 3 playing in a sandbox, and it looks like they're playing together, but one says monsters and the other one says trucks, and they're not playing together. They're playing alongside each other, but they're not playing cooperatively. And that is a distinction that is important, because parallel play happens in those early childhood and preschool years, and they're not necessarily engaged with other kiddos at that time. What we're seeing and what they're observing is how to engage in social groups, and that they continue to see even at home within the family. What school and other settings does is provide them access to other groups so that they can begin to understand how they function in different relationships. And they do have some access to that because there is typically a nuclear family unit, and then there are a couple other people outside of that unit. Do we want to send them to school just for that piece? I don't necessarily know if it's going to stop them from being a social animal when they're adult if they don't have it right now. The plan is for this not to be long-term. So if we are able to get back on track and they are able to get back into their social settings, I don't really see a problem with you keeping them home. If we're concerned about them getting sick, missing a year of school, I don't necessarily imagine is going to be a huge deal. Will it shift their social development? Absolutely. Will it stunt it? Not necessarily. Again, if you are worried about it, there's a lot of ways that we can have those social interactions that don't necessarily require school. I've seen a lot of groups pop up of moms that are having, you know, a group of 5, and they all have communication and trust each other with being honest about who they've been exposed to and those sorts of things. So that's if you have people that are high risk in your family, you can create a small group. We have outings, we go to the park, we do things like that. So they have those social outlets without necessarily having to go to school and be exposed at school.
Okay, let's see. How can we identify age-appropriate behaviors versus stress from COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a tough question because they're all over the place right now. And what you see typically in a lot of this is a regressive behavior. So your kiddo who was functioning just fine is now all of a sudden like in a puddle of himself on the floor and doesn't look anything like he used to. And this might even be something that we see even within a single day, that they're fine and then they're not, and then they're fine and then they're not. What I might suggest to you is if you have a child that has been developmentally typical and has been functioning at a level that you feel is age appropriate up until this time, and you see behaviors that look regressive, I would imagine that that is trauma and anxiety and grief. And I would address it not necessarily as something that is defiance or something that needs to be addressed so much as it is a behavioral expression of their emotional experience at the time. So untangling those is really tricky, and it's tricky. It feels like it's even trickier now than it is on a regular, in our regular routine that we used to have. But the more that we attend, again, with compassion to what's going on for them, the safer they'll feel to express, the more likely it is that they'll be able to come to you with those concerns because they trust that you'll hear them and respond to them as opposed to react. Because that's a really tricky thing right now, is not reacting, because I want it to be okay too. And I want you to be quiet and I have work to do and all of those things. So if we can create that space to respond to them and attend to their emotional need, then they have then a safe foundation from which to launch back into their developmental curve. So it's just like a cat, like a foundational base, a secure base. When you open the door and the cat goes out like 6 inches and comes back, and you've seen kiddos do this too, right? And they go out a little bit more and they come back. They're maintaining that connection with that safe base. And the safer that base is, the more likely they are able to go out and explore and continue to explore and expand as much as they can. So that feels kind of important too.
All right. So since COVID, daily routines tend to change dramatically. So sometimes we're sending children to in-laws or our own parents. Maybe one day a week they go to preschool. How can we make this changing daily routine less stressful?
This is another great question. I'm curious how old the kiddos are in this scenario, because there's different things that we can do for different age groups. If they're a little bit older, we can get a visual calendar, or we can mark on the calendar different colors so that they can see that this is the day we go to grandma's and this is the day we go to Mima's, and that this is the day we stay home. We can also make them little calendars with pictures on them, and I would take pictures and I would, wrap them in packing tape, clear tape, and put a hole in it and say, okay, and so this is what we're doing today. So they have a picture, a reference, something that they have control over and they can access themselves to say, okay, so this is what I'm doing. I'm going here, here, and here, and here. So they have some semblance of control or order, or at least what to expect around that day. You can talk about it the night before. You can say, hey, tomorrow, this is what we're doing. And you can show them the pictures. If you have these little I think I even have one right here. I don't know if you have them, but these little rings, right? Then you can put holes in the pictures, and you can put them on a ring, and then you can say, here's today's plan, and you can hand it to them and they can take it with them. So they know who's picking them up, and they know who's dropping them off, and they know that you'll be home before dinner or whatever it is. You can take a picture of these different things and create this visual calendar so that they have, again, some sense of control over what's going on. And then if they're asking questions, you can say, let's look at your calendar, because that's something that then they have control, for lack of a better term. They're going to feel more confident, and they're going to have more efficacy in their ability to take care of that themselves. And that they can access that information is going to help them feel less anxiety. The other thing that you can do is really create your routines around outside of that, so that our morning routine is fairly similar. And whether or not it starts at 9 or whether it starts at 7 a.m. or if that varies, we can make sure that there are some specific things that happen in the course of that routine. So we always eat breakfast, we always get 20 minutes of TV, we always brush our teeth, and then we get in the car. Whatever it is, I'm making it up. But there can be a routine in that starts to feel really stable, so that those parts of the day are something that they can count on, and also with the end of the day. And again, this gets really tricky because that might not be possible, right? You might pick up at 7 one night and 5 the next, bath one night, not the next. People are losing their minds one night, so nothing happens. But what can happen is bedtime routine. So that we always have a book, we always do these things, and then we go to bed. You can also have something that is your routine, like every time you drop them off, you have a little saying and you bump elbows and you give a kiss. There's some kind of little ritual around how you say goodbye or how we start the day that they can start to count on. And when those things occur, then they can go, okay, so everything is at least as normal as it's going to be, because those things are consistent for me. Littler kiddos are a little trickier because they can't necessarily see the visual calendar. So a lot of those more behavioral routines and rituals are going to be a lot more helpful. Again, even if they can't necessarily engage in the ritual with you, to see you do it, to have that be something that they see repetitively is going to be helpful. And what we know about brain development is positive, repetitive input is what creates stability and safety. Positive, repetitive input over and over and over and over and over again. So if that's something that happens every morning, then it's a normal morning and it feels good, even if everything else was basket case today. So stuff like that, I would start to attend to more of the behavioral pieces for the littlers. And then if you've got a little bit older kids, sometimes a visual calendar can be really helpful.
Okay, Jen, we had another question in chat
Yeah.
From a parent whose 5-year-old is bilingual, but he's struggling to communicate in English. And so she believes that virtual school is going to be really hard for him. She was unsure about sending, she was in double mind about sending him, whether or not to send him to school in person, but they have a vulnerable family member at home. So she doesn't have a choice in that. She's going to come home. So she wants to know how she can help him more. She said they read a lot, but he is not really expressing himself.
So I guess I'm not expressing himself. Let me see. So communicate in English is virtual school.
So I think it's communicating in English is where he's struggling.
Okay. So I'm imagining that English is the second language for this kiddo.
I think so, yes.
Okay. So first of all, that will come. The door is not shut. He's 5 years old. So there still is a great capacity to learn English and the opportunity to do so and become fluent and an effective communicator in English is not going to go away. It's a little stifled right now. The access is not necessarily there, but it doesn't mean it's going to be gone. I think reading books is a great idea. I know that there has been suggestions that watching TV in English or other sort of not interactive access to English that is not interactive is not necessarily as impactful as we want it to be. So just watching programs in English isn't necessarily going to give him that input that you want. what would be more likely to be helpful is to have those conversations, to perhaps have one or two people that he can communicate in English with. But also, that's one of those things that is probably stifled by the anxiety or the stress of what's going on. So if he has taken a step back and he is communicating, but he's not doing it in English, I would be fairly prone to meet the need where he's at. Because if he is expressing in his first language, and there is room for that, then I wouldn't necessarily complicate it by having him do it in English, because these things are hard to articulate. This is a difficult time, and there's lots of feelings, and especially for little ones, there's no language for it. So if he's communicating in his first language, let's do it. Let's have those conversations, and let's sprinkle as much English in as we can in there, but not necessarily withhold the conversations because it's not in English, and support the English as much as possible. But I don't necessarily know if it needs to be an expectation. Again, I myself, and I know a ton of other parents that I've spoken to, are like, they're going to be behind next year. They're going to be this. They're not going to have these things. And so when they get to the next grade, or when they get to their preschool class, they're going to be missing these pieces, and it's going to be really difficult. We have to understand that every single kid is not going to have those pieces when they get to the next year. Nobody does. It's not that your child individually is going to be behind. Everybody is not going to be where we want them to be, or at least what we have had expectations for them to be in the past. And English, 5 years old, I totally get that, because we want them to be fluent. We want them to be prepared and be in, I imagine he's going into kindergarten, or would be going into kindergarten. And so that feels really, really important. And I think there are ways to access that don't necessarily require you to send him to school if you do have a family member that is high risk. And there are interactive things online. And again, it's not, for a kiddo that age, it's not necessarily it doesn't hold their attention very long. It just doesn't. But there's a lot of interactive games, there's puzzles, and then we can also have groups, and we can do a lot of things online where there is interaction, and it's not necessarily doesn't necessarily promote English as much as a one-on-one interaction with a person, but there's lots of other places that we can get that as well. So I don't want to dismiss that, because I think it's really important. And I would also encourage you to not be too concerned about it, because those things will come. And if we're distracted right now, we're all distracted right now.
Jen, we had another question about from someone who's worried that her 4-year-old is not going to build independence because she isn't going to preschool. And so she wonders if you have any tips about that, about how you can get over separation anxiety. And I think we had a second question on that.
Well. And I believe that there was a question that was sent in previously about promoting independence and what that looks like right now. And so I know this is a hot topic too. Okay. So a couple different things. One, we would all like a little independence right now, at least us adults, right? We would love to have the door closed and not have anyone come in. The boundaries that we all have around like having space or going to work and having separation between work and home and school and all those things, a lot of those boundaries are gone. And so it's really hard for us to sort of create our own independence and maintain our own independence. And then it's really hard for us to teach our kiddos that independence when we're all on top of each other at home all the time. One way to do that is to create however you want to term it, but alone time. So if we're all at home all day long and we're all together, that there is an hour, depending on the kid's age. If they're 2.5, it might be less. If they're 4, it might be more, but a little bit of time where you do your own independent activities. So you can go to your room, you can play with whatever you want in your room, you can read, you can do whatever you want, but that's a time where you're going to be alone and we're going to all be alone. We're all in the same house and we're all in the same place and together, but we're not necessarily interacting. So that can be part of your routine if you're all home. that can also be something that is encouraged, even if you are sending them to grandparents, or if they have other places that they're going in the day. Some of the adults might actually really appreciate that, is that there is a half hour designated in the day where everybody goes to their prospective corners and does their own thing. The other thing that I think is playing a role in this is that as parents, and especially parents in this day and age, for lack of a better term, we have this sense that like the kids need to be entertained, or they need to have an activity. And they actually don't. A lot of parents that I've spoken to are killing themselves trying to come up with the next project and the next craft and the next activity. And what are we going to do today? And there's this constant pressure to entertain them. And if you're unavailable because you're working or you have things to do, then to somehow then provide entertainment for them. And so then there's that like, well, I can't be there, so here you can watch TV for 4 hours, because I know TV has become a tool for me, not for my kids. Like, here, watch TV because I can't do anything else right now. And what that robs the kid of is their opportunity to use their own imagination and to develop that independence. So there might be times when you don't entertain them and we say, oh, I don't know, what are we going to do? Let's find something to do. And it's up to them to figure it out. And at first, if this is new to them, they're going to wander around. They're going to have a clue. They're going to come back and ask you, because it's never been put upon them to figure that out for themselves. But that is absolutely something that kiddos can do, even as young as 1.5. I'm not suggesting that you leave a 1-year-old alone for 4 hours, but if you were to not entertain a young child, they will find something to do, and they will find something that is developmentally appropriate, and they will do it, and it will meet a developmental need. Kids play with something and play with something and play with something until it meets the need, and then they move on. So you've got a kid that picks up the same thing for like 6-7 months, and you're like, are you serious? Aren't we tired of that? As soon as they're done with it, as soon as it's met the need, they will move on from it. So if we provide those opportunities, then they will actually be very much self-directed in meeting those needs on their own. A lot of times when we're providing those activities, we're providing things that we think they should be doing, or that don't necessarily meet the need, but just as an activity, it's a busyness. And we don't have to do that. So creating those opportunities for them to play on their own. Again, if this is something you haven't done before, it's going to take a little bit of practice, because they're used to being entertained. They're used to, if you're not doing something with them, if there's not an activity, then they know that they get to turn on the TV. And this time we're like, yeah, we're not going to turn on TV. And I don't know what you're going to do. Maybe we put 3 things out and have them choose. Maybe we say, you can do whatever you want. You just know the rules of the house. Depends on their age. But there's lots of different things that kiddos can do to entertain themselves. And we can continue to sort of promote that as the independence, that's their own ability to self-entertain, and to sort of be self-directed in their activities. And that will in and of itself promote independence, because it's going to promote confidence too. Kiddos that are able to do this are a lot less likely to come to you and say, I'm bored. Because I'm bored means I'm not entertained. And I mean, they might line up every fork by size, and they might completely organize something by color. And it might make a mess. It might not be what you want. It might take longer to clean up. But those sorts of things really allow them to honor their developmental level and to create and promote imagination and independence. So that, I think, is an important part of it. And the clinginess is also something that feels more about the grief and the anxiety, that I wouldn't necessarily be really focused on as a problem right now. Yes, they are more clingy. Yes, that's not how they were before. And yes, their entire world is disrupted. So I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about them being clingy as a sort of a developmental regression or a sign that they're not going to be independent, so much as it is that they're needing a little bit of extra support. And they might be stalled out, but they're not stopped. They're not stunted. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. I actually had the same question, and
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you answered that. It gave me a lot of ideas too. So we have a set of 2.5-year-old twins who have their behavior has become a little bit more aggressive lately. So how can we stop this behavior, give them space from one another while they're all stuck under the same roof?
Yeah. 2.5-year-old twins. That's a handful right now. And again, there's a lot going on. I think that was one of the questions that was posed before. Is that correct? So I have a little
Yes.
bit of information.
Yes.
Okay. So how can I change daily routines? Okay. So again, creating some of that time where we don't play together. And maybe for kids that are 2.5, maybe we have 2 or 3 sessions of alone play in a day that are 15 minutes long, right? Or 10 minutes long. And we'll see what they're developmentally capable of too. If they've always been entertained, if there's this constant sort of going, then they're going to have a hard time separating themselves for that period of time. And so maybe we start with just 5 minutes. 2.5-year-olds have an attention span of about 3 to 4 minutes. And so we might start with that. And as they start to find themselves in their own play, they might sit and play for a long time and they don't want to come out. Don't know if that's true for every kiddo, but it's certainly a possibility. And as I think a little bit more about this question is that they said that there are times when they're at mom's or a mother-in-law's or there's a sitter because you guys are working full time. So there's lots of different people coming in and out. And creating that independent playtime can be something that any person can implement. And it can also be used as a tool or perhaps a weapon that mom is using or dad is using to sort of to stifle some of those things. So maybe we call independent playtime when they start to get heated. Maybe there is activities that we do, and then there are other times when they're able to play with each other. If there is no access and they're just having a hard time, then maybe we just take a break. And a break isn't necessarily where you're expected to go and play in your room, but it's just that we got too heated and we need to take a break. I like to separate feelings from behaviors. So you're not necessarily in timeout. You're not in trouble for being mad. You're in trouble for hitting them, right? And there's a difference. So we can be mad. And so how are we going to be mad? And start using language around how to express those things without necessarily using our fists. Again, for 2.5, the span between I'm angry and I'm punching you is like, they go from 0 to 60 in like 0.27 seconds. So it's really hard to catch it. But we can say then, oh, what would we do instead? And we can start to share some ideas. If they're hitting, maybe they can hit something else. There's something that they're allowed to hit, so they don't get in trouble necessarily. And they have an opportunity to express those feelings. And so maybe we have just times where we take a break. So we're not in trouble for doing something. We're having a chance to take care of ourselves because we're getting a little bit worked up. And those can be in separate areas. Again, if this is new for the kiddos, then you're going to have a whole other issue where they're confronted with a new behavior, and it messes up their thing because they used to get to hit their brother and now they don't get to, and it probably makes them more mad. And so some of these interventions, you really want to pick and choose about what's going to work for your family and what doesn't. I wouldn't pick 7 interventions and running yourself silly all day and wondering what's working and what's not. Because then you're just going to be mad and overwhelmed and exhausted more than you are now. So I would pick 1 or 2. I would say, okay, we're going to try this. We're going to try independent play, and we're going to try break times. And that's all that we do. And the physical aggression is fairly age typical for 2 little boys that are very similar and that are often together a lot. I imagine you're seeing quite a bit of that. And I imagine that you're seeing an escalation in that through these times of COVID and all of the changes, because that might be exactly where they're expressing their anxiety, their frustration, their anger, all of those things. And it's an easy, accessible thing. When I used to work at a grief center, right? You ask little kids, little 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, if they're sad about grandma or dad who died, and they say, nope, I'm fine. But then they fall down and they skin their knee and they cry for 15, 20 minutes about their knee, because the knee is an accessible, right? And it's sort of a appropriate thing to cry about. And it's a way that they can emote that doesn't require the full emotional articulation as I'm really sad about dad today. So those feelings might be in there. And so another thing that we can do is narrate. And that is just giving language to what you believe the internal experience is. So I bet this is a really frustrating day. It's frustrating for me too. I can see that it's making us really mad. When I get mad, this is what I can do to take care of myself. So we have an opportunity to narrate, to give them an inner dialogue, to give them language to the experiences that they're having. And then we can do those same things: normalize, validate, and model an appropriate coping skill or way to manage those feelings. Those normalize, model, validate, and model are often a big helper in parenting. The other thing that we can do is when we say those things, we can ask them, especially for a 2.5-year-old, is like, because just saying I'm angry is so abstract. Like, okay, I'm angry, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what you're talking about, but this is how I feel. So we can really start to talk more about what that feeling is in the body, because that's something that they connect with earlier. So I wouldn't have this conversation in the moment when they're punching each other in the family room. I would have this conversation when things are calm, Saturday breakfast, cereal, before everything gets out of hand, whatever it is. When you get mad, when you want to hit your brother, what does it feel like? Do you get a tummy ache? Do you feel it in your hands? Does it feel hot or cold? Is it red? I mean, some of these more like concrete ideas is something that a child that age can connect to much earlier. And so then if you have that information and you've had that conversation, then the next time they're blowing out in the family room, you can say, is it feeling like, is your tummy upset right now? If we're getting that feeling, then let's do something to take care of you. Is it red? Because I remember red is when we get really mad and we want to punch. So let's stop right now and do something else. So we can kind of start to interject and build their emotional awareness and intelligence around, okay, I've got that feeling in my tummy. That means X, Y, Z, and I need to do this to take care of myself. So we can start to play with that. Yeah.
Oh, we have maybe 3 more questions, so I thought we'd try to get them in kind of quickly.
Yes, let's do it.
Have a chance.
Yeah.
Molly, did you want to?
Sure. So yeah, rapid fire. My 4-year-old daughter has developed a fear of bugs. So I imagine a lot of children are developing fears, just like you said, and freaking out. So what can we do to address that? And then, yeah, so I'll stop there if you want to give like a 2-minute answer.
A quick one. Yeah. So don't flood. So it's this tendency to like then introduce or push the bugs, right? But you're only going to sort of intensify and really concretize that fear. Create a space for her to have that fear, but not necessarily force it. Flooding is like when someone's scared of water, so you throw them in. Don't do that. Have them be scared. Let them express whatever it is. And then I would say, again, I would narrate it. I can see we're scared of the bugs. Sometimes they really freak us out. I would also show that I'm not scared and model what it's like to just pick up the bug and move it, or to handle that. And even to say like, I'm really scared of it too, but this is how I can handle it. So again, that's sort of the overcoming, that I can see this thing and I can address it and I can take care of myself. Is it going to go away? Not necessarily. And that's a lot of girls find bugs at 4 and are completely disgusted. So give it a little bit of space. And I also wouldn't shame it. Don't say like, oh my gosh, it's just a bug. Don't be ridiculous, those sorts of things, because then we've got this thing where they're really scared, but they can't express it. And now we've got this whole other mistrust and communication issue. So just let it be, show them how to overcome, and don't feed it.
All right. If you could give a, I don't know, like 1 or 2 sentences on how to talk to a 3.5-year-old in an age-appropriate way about why things are closed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So again, this is going to be something that is really dependent on your family values and your interests, or your family, what feels important to you. We could talk about germs in whatever way we know about them before, because you can say, you know, how people get sick in the winter and we get colds and then everybody gets sick. Well, there's a cold right now that is bigger and it's making people really sick. So we're just making sure that we stay away. Remember how we wash our hands all the time? That's to make sure we don't get germies. And so we're making sure, because this is a bigger germy. So we're making sure that we stay away from it. So whatever context that you have within your family that has addressed some of those things before, I would capitalize on that language and then build on it.
Very good. And last, we have, so children were isolated, and now some of us feel more comfortable about going on play dates, but we're getting a little bit more overwhelmed afterwards.
Yeah.
Is there something we can help them with?
So everything is overwhelming right now. It might not be that it's necessarily socially overwhelming. It just might be that in general they're overwhelmed, and so it's not that much room before we hit our peak. Perhaps we limit the time. Perhaps we take breaks, even within the play date, that we go and check in with mom and maybe sit down and have a snack or take a breath. And that again, when we are having those moments, that we just sit with it. So we can say, oh yeah, I can see it was a little much, huh? Or maybe we're feeling a little overwhelmed right now. So let's just take a break. Maybe we'll have, you know, some TV time. Maybe we'll tuck in and watch a movie. Maybe we'll cuddle and read a book. Is there something that would help you feel good? Figuring out what your kids' coping skills are super important. And we can do that again with those serial conversations of like, what makes you feel good? You ask a kid what their coping skills are, they have no idea. But if you say, what could you do that feels really good, you could do for a long time? And they're like, color, play with dinosaurs, da, 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 da. Those are things that feel good. And so we can capitalize on those and use those as their coping strategies when they are in need of them.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. That was so helpful. I want to thank you for your words of wisdom and your great advice. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. I want to let you know about 2 exciting programs we'll have coming up in August. We have another parenting strategies webinar with Janet Damon on the topic of how to talk with your kids about race. That will be on Tuesday, August 18th at 4 p.m. Look for that on our website. That's a virtual event. And our annual early literacy speaker event will take place virtually. We are going to be welcoming Dr. Laura Jana, who's a pediatrician, and she's the author of this book, The Toddler Brain. She talks about the key skills that children will need to be effective and successful in an ever-changing world. So that will be Wednesday, August 26th at 7 p.m. Meanwhile, if you have any particular needs, feel free to ask a librarian at the arapahoelibraries.org, and we are happy to follow up if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.